The knock came after curfew. 3 soft raps, then nothing, the sound of a man who already knew that silence was the only thing keeping him alive. The farmer set down his lamp before he opened the door, because a lamp held wrong could be seen from the road. Standing in his yard was a stranger in a flight suit, half his face streaked with engine soot, a parachute bundled under one arm like a confession. The farmer had perhaps 4 seconds to decide. He had no weapon, no training, no orders from anyone. He had only the knowledge, drilled into every occupied Frenchman by 1,000 printed notices, that what he was about to do carried a sentence of death. He stepped back from the door and let the men in. This is not the story of one farmer. It is the story of thousands like him, men and women whose names mostly never reached a history book, who looked at a stranger falling out of the sky into their fields and decided, in the space of a held breath, to become the most dangerous kind of soldier there was, an unarmed one. Consider what Henri actually knew, standing in that doorway. He knew that a German aircraft had gone down or been hit somewhere over the district that night. The drone of engines, the flash on the horizon, were impossible to miss in a country with so few lights left burning. He knew German patrols would comb the fields and hedgerows for exactly this kind of stranger before sunrise. He knew that French police, under Vichy's authority, were obligated to report what he was seeing this instant. And he knew, because every adult in occupied France knew, that the posted penalty for what he was about to do was not a fine or a warning. It was death, for him, and very possibly for his family alongside him. None of that knowledge stopped his hand from pulling the latch. By 1943, an Allied airman shot down over occupied Europe had roughly even odds of getting home, not because of his guns or his armor, but because of people exactly like the men who opened that door. Historians estimate some 12,000 French civilians took part in hiding and moving downed airmen during the occupation. More than 5,000 men made it out through these networks alive, many of them American. The machinery that moved them had a name borrowed, with grim accuracy, from the Underground Railroad a century before: safe houses, secret codes, guides who walked strangers across borders by night. The Germans had a name for it too. They called it terrorism, and they hunted it accordingly. The farmer in our story, call him Henri, as so many were called, a name standing in for thousands whose own names are simply lost, farmed a few hectares outside a village in northern France, the kind of place too small to appear on a German staff map. He had a wife, 2 children, and a barn with a hayloft that had, until that night, held nothing more dangerous than last season's grain. Now it held an American. The decree that governed Henry's life had been posted in the village square more than once. The Wehrmacht's military commander in France made it explicit, in French and in German, on broadsides nailed to church doors and town halls: anyone who aided enemy forces, anyone who sheltered Allied servicemen, anyone caught with their equipment, would face trial in a German court, and very possibly a firing squad. It was not an empty threat. Across occupied Europe, helpers were tortured, deported to concentration camps, or shot outright when caught. Families paid for what one member had done. The penalty was not designed to punish only the guilty. It was designed to make the entire population too frightened to help at all. It mostly failed. Up and down occupied France and Belgium, ordinary people built networks to move airmen out anyway, quietly, stubbornly, in defiance of exactly the threat meant to stop them. The largest was the Comet Line, founded in 1941 by a 24-year-old Belgian woman named André de Jong. She told the airmen she guided to call her by her code name. "I would like you to call me by my code name, which is Didi," she said, "and you will be my little children." In 3 years, her line and its roughly 3,000 helpers moved 776 people to safety, most of them British and American airmen, walking them from Brussels through Paris, across the Pyrenees on foot, into neutral Spain and home. 65 to 70% of Comet's helpers were women. Many were teenagers. These networks ran on people exactly like Henri, not soldiers, not spies, just farmers and shopkeepers and dentists and schoolgirls who had decided that doing nothing was its own kind of choice, and one they couldn't live with. A farmer named Desire Geron once took in 3 exhausted Americans, fed them wine and hot soup by his fire, and pointed them toward the next link in a chain he could not see the end of. None of these men were professional resistance fighters. They were simply the first link, the ones who opened the door. Henry's airmen stayed 3 weeks in that hayloft. Long enough for Henri to learn the particular silence of a man trying not to cough. Long enough to memorize the sound of German patrol trucks on the road and judge, by engine note alone, whether they were slowing down. His wife sewed civilian trousers from old curtain fabric so the American wouldn't be caught in a flight suit. His children were told nothing, not because Henri didn't trust them, but because a child who didn't know couldn't accidentally tell. Every day he kept his guest alive, Henri was gambling everything he had against an enemy with every advantage. The Gestapo ran informants into villages exactly like his. A single careless word, from a jealous neighbor, a frightened collaborator, a man broken under interrogation, could end with the farmhouse surrounded at dawn. It happened to real helpers more than once. One French resistance leader, a 58-year-old woman named Marie-Louise Dessard who ran an escape line out of Toulouse under the name Françoise, had to flee her own safe house in January 1944 after a captured guide's notebook gave up her address. She spent weeks hiding in attics and basements with the Gestapo actively hunting her, and kept moving airmen anyway. By the war's end she had helped more than 700 escape. The risk only sharpened as the war went on. In July 1944, Hitler signed a secret order on the treatment of what Nazi propaganda called terrorist airmen, declaring that captured Allied flyers identified under that label were no longer to be treated as prisoners of war at all, but killed on the spot. In the war's final year, mobs egged on by state propaganda lynched downed airmen in German towns before any soldier could intervene. The Germans even coined a word for it, Fliegermord, flyer murder. Against that backdrop, every quiet farmhouse that chose to hide a man instead of hand him over was not a small kindness. It was an act of defiance carried out in total secrecy, with no audience, no medal waiting at the end of it, and everything to lose. There was a practical military logic behind all this danger, even if Henri never thought of it that way. A trained bomber pilot or navigator represented months of instruction and enormous cost to put back in the air. Every airman who slipped home through an escape line instead of vanishing into a POW camp, or worse, was a trained crewman returned to duty almost for free. The Allied High Command understood this well enough that by 1944, men who had successfully evaded once were sometimes pulled from combat entirely, judged too valuable to risk falling into German hands a second time, where under torture they might give up the names of the very people who had saved them. London understood the value of the network too, and tried to professionalize what had begun as pure improvisation. The British intelligence branch MI9, and, after America entered the war, its American counterpart, MI6, trained aircrews before they ever flew a mission, how to use a hidden compass sewn into a uniform button, how to read a silk escape map folded small enough to vanish inside a boot heel, how to behave if a French farmer's door opened and a decision had to be made in seconds on both sides of the threshold. None of that training mattered without a Henri on the other end of it. The maps and compasses got a man moving. Only a stranger willing to risk everything could get him hidden, fed, and passed along alive. The danger cut both ways, and not every story ended at a farmhouse door. Civilian mobs, whipped up for years by state propaganda that branded Allied airmen as murderers of German children, sometimes reached a downed flyer before any resistance helper could. A British sergeant named Cyril Sibley parachuted into a German garden in 1944. A woman there tried to bandage his wounds and gave him wine before local Nazi officials arrived, took him from her, and shot him in front of her. American crews fared no better in some towns. Bomber gunners from the 303rd Bomb Group were murdered by German civilians the same year, in killings that later led to war crimes trials. It is a grim mirror to Henri's story, proof that the 4 seconds in any given doorway could break either way, and that the helpers who chose differently were choosing against the current of their entire society, not with it. Henri never knew any of that calculus. He only knew that the American in his hayloft was someone's son, and that handing him over felt like a kind of murder he wasn't prepared to commit. On the appointed night, a stranger came for the airman just as quietly as he had arrived, a guide from the next link in the chain, with false papers and a story already prepared. Henri never learned the man's real name, never learned if he made it across the mountains, never received so much as a letter. That was by design. The less each helper knew, the less the Gestapo could extract from any single one of them if the chain ever broke. This is, in fact, exactly what happened to one real American crew member, Sergeant Sidney Smith, after his Wellington bomber went down near Surgens, France, in December 1942. A farmer named Emile Cochin took him in for the night. By the next stop in the line, Smith was in the hands of a woman who spoke English. The stop after that brought civilian clothes from a dentist. After that, a law student moved him by train to Paris. No single helper saw the whole journey. No single helper could betray it. Henri went back to his fields the next morning as though nothing had happened, because that was the entire point. The danger never announced itself with drums or medals. It looked exactly like an ordinary farm, an ordinary harvest, an ordinary man walking behind an ordinary plow, while underneath, an entire shadow war moved through barns and cellars and church basements across the width of occupied France. When the Allies finally swept through in the late summer and autumn of 1944, most of these helpers simply went back to their lives. They didn't ask for recognition, because recognition could still get you killed right up until liberation actually arrived. Many never spoke of what they'd done at all, even to their own children. It took years, sometimes decades, for the men they'd saved to track them down again, write a letter, or simply show up at the farmhouse door to say thank you in person. Multiply Henri by 12,000, and you start to understand the true shape of the occupation, not as a single front line, but as a country quietly riddled with small, deliberate refusals. A farmer who chose not to look away. A schoolgirl who chose to carry a message instead of staying safely indoors. A woman who chose to hide in an attic rather than stop running a network that had already cost her everything once. None of them won a battle in the way the word usually means. They simply decided, alone, in the dark, that they would not be the kind of person who closed the door. Most never collected a medal at all. The records that do exist read almost apologetically, as if even history weren't quite sure how to file an act of courage that produced no headline and no body count. A name on a list. A line in a captured airman's debriefing report, decades later, filed away in an archive few people will ever open. For every helper history remembers, dozens more went to their own graves having told almost no one, not out of modesty exactly, but because the habit of silence that had kept them alive for years was not a thing easily put down once the war ended. That is the part of this war easiest to forget, looking back from the distance of factories and fleets and famous names. The machinery of liberation was enormous, but it was carried, link, by people with no rank and no weapon, who measured their courage in the length of a single night's silence, and the simple, terrifying decision to open a door they had every reason to keep shut.